Welcome, everyone, to today's open meeting of the NSB-NSF Commission on Merit Review. My name is Stephen Willard, Chair of this commission, and I am accompanied by the Commission's Vice Chair, Wanda Ward. The Commission on Merit Review is comprised of members from the National Science Board and the National Science Foundation. Let's start by taking a roll. Roger Beachy. Alicia Needler.
Here.
Steve Leith.
Here.
Candace Major.
Here.
Matt Malkin.
Here.
Sarah K. McDonald. Julia Phillips.
Here.
Scott Stanley.
Here.
Kevin Stassen. And Wanda Ward.
Here.
Our NSBO liaisons are Portia Flowers, Ann Bushmiller, and Andreas Suchel, and our executive secretary is Jan Adamek. We are also joined by Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellow Michael Stewart and AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow Andrew Zeidel. Thank you all for a productive meeting earlier this month. At this time, I'd like us to focus our attention on the summary document, which has been unchanged since our last meeting and is located at tab 3.2 for your convenience. Last time we explored potential policy recommendations. Today, our focus will be on exploring potential implementation and accountability suggestions. As a reminder, the Commission, which was established by the Board, has always positioned policy as its main focus, which is why we are ultimately delivering policy recommendations to the Board. However, if the Board is to consider our recommendations for policy changes, how those policies are carried out and accounted for matters. So we have a great opportunity to also offer our suggestions for how these potential policies can be successful. As a reminder, the time to consider a final number of suggestions will come soon enough. For now, I ask we remain open to potential opportunities. With that, I'll hand it over to John, who will facilitate today's discussion. John?
Thank you, Steve, Wanda, and members of the Commission for engaging in today's discussion on assessing and prioritizing topics for potential implementation and accountability suggestions. This is aligned with our overall work plan timeline toward our milestone of sharing preliminary results at the May 2024 NSB meeting. Before we jump into the discussion, I wanted to start with some brief housekeeping and acknowledgements. First, thank you for your engaged discussion. The week before last, we have made some further adjustments, so hopefully you can get off to a smooth start. Second, well, I'm here in front of you. Other members of the MRX staff team, as Steve mentioned, are also online. So if you experience any technical difficulties, please send a chat in the Zoom chat, and we'll do our best to respond and solve it on the sidelines. And then third, since we have two topics today and a rather large set of prior comments, we've made some adjustments to the discussion format that will hopefully allow us to get through them all in the time we have today. So overall, I'm starting with this intro, and then we'll move on to look at the collected items and open the discussion amongst all of you. And then we'll reserve some time at the end to identify any needed follow-up actions for our next meeting and beyond. So similar to our previous conversation. As a reminder, you collectively are our starting point today. The experiences you bring to this group, the content you've heard in the meetings to date, the ideas and questions you've shared. And for your convenience, the staff were tasked with extracting an initial summary. We've shared that with you in diligent, and then based on the records of the past meeting minutes, and have provided this in the written and the visual formats. This is the same set of starting materials that we used at our last meeting when we focused on policy-related items. We've made some tweaks, adding numbering and proffering some further finer groupings of related ideas to assist in carrying out the live virtual collaboration aspects of this discussion. We know this is not a perfect summary, that current thinking may not be the same as what was mentioned months ago, and that understanding will continue to evolve. So this is an opportunity for MRX members to consider the initial summary we've compiled and provide input to add things we may have missed or other ways. And I realize I'm not sharing my slides, am I? Pardon me. Sorry. backing up, as I mentioned, we know it's not a perfect summary, that thinking may have changed, and that thinking may not be the same as what was mentioned months ago, and that understanding is going to continue to evolve. So there's an opportunity for the MRX members to consider the initial summary we've compiled, provide input to add things we may have missed or other ways of potentially grouping items. And in today's discussion, we're going to focus on the subset of the ideas related to the implementation and accountability themes, building off our discussion on the 18th. So we're looking to identify points of consensus and points of uncertainty, and if needed, follow-up actions and tasks. It is important to note that the purpose of today's discussion is not to craft detailed language. We will be continuing these discussions over the coming months, and the input today will be part of informing further refinements. To do this, we will focus just on the visual sticky board arrangement of the items on screen to center the discussion. Given that we have the two themes and a lot of separate ideas, as I mentioned a moment ago, we've added numbering and some further pre-grouping to assist with the discussion. So instead of round robin, we'll work through each of the topics. I'll kick it off by giving a brief summary of the pre-clustering in one of the topics to explain the groupings of ideas. Then we'll proceed to a discussion of the ideas under the theme. First, to check if there's anything that we missed or need to change with respect to the individual ideas, and then to check the sense of the commission on the groupings. We'll continue this process through both themes in each grouping. Based on the number of items, we're shooting at about 7 to 10 minutes per subtopic or 35 minutes per each of the top level themes to keep us on schedule. Lastly, if needed, we'll come back to a parking lot that will accumulate any items where we don't have a consensus or agreement or further uncertainty we need to explore. And we'll spend up to 5 minutes talking back through each of those points of divergence to determine if we can reach agreement based on today's scope, or if not, what further follow-up is needed. Anything we couldn't get to and in the parking lot will be part of our work to identify follow-ups. So with that, I want to pause and check if there are questions before proceeding. Not seeing any hands going up, and I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so I will keep going. Oh, we've got Alicia has raised her hand. So please,
Sorry.
Alicia, you
I
have
had to find my hand button. So based on the policy discussion from last time, and given the grid of bubbles that we have to work from, we're just talking about each about various items. Are we taking away anything from our list? If we all say, you know, this sounded like a good idea at the time, or this really hasn't come up in any other place, are we just like, what's the process of whittling this down?
So just like with last time, if there are things that are less salient or don't seem to sort of connect to the rest of it, and we want to set them aside or put them under another thing, like, you know, reduce where they are to a sub point of something else, that sort of combining, that sort of setting aside is something that, yes, those are changes or things that we consider. And in fact, as I go through, we tried to do a little bit of that clustering there to identify the ones that did not seem to match with other things and offer that as we go through. Any other questions? Okay. So great question, Alicia, because it does follow through to this. So now we're going to turn to the discussion. I'm only going to have this slide up for a moment, and then we're going to swap out to share the board. But what we're going to do is we're going to work through, as I mentioned, each set of groupings. I'll recap them briefly and ask that you raise your hand, and we'll work through the inputs or comments you guys want to add to that. The prompts here are offered for your consideration, and I'm sending and I will copy and paste these into the chat right now so you can refer to them as we go forward. Okay, looks like it came through. Awesome. Great. So those are there, so you can reference those. And now I'm going to pause this share, swap my screens, and bring up the board. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Maybe out one. Okay. Here we go. Can everyone see that? It should be focused and zoomed in on the section. Awesome. Okay. So this is the same file that you guys have on the SharePoint. So if anyone wants to jump into the file and read along as we go, it's there. This is an editor view of it, not a presentation view, so I can do that as we go and record the notes. As we had before, we've got the implementation area sort of section and the accountability section. I'm going to start with implementation and give a quick overview here. We split this up into a top level suggestions for program design, suggestions for PI education and development, suggestions for reviewer performance, suggestions for award decision making. And as you can see, these are not all in even lines, and that's some of the subgrouping that we've done. And I will start at the top here and work our way down with suggestions for program design. So in this section, we had 8 different comments that were pulled out of the various minutes from the past meetings, including one coming out of the COSC meeting in June, where it was considered blind review, lottery system, and other mechanisms to disrupt bias in the merit review process. I2, develop a state-of-the-art bank of additional criteria to help identify common themes across funding opportunities. And I3 here, provide clearer budgeting expectations for BI activities and evaluation, including but not limited to how much of an award should be spent on BI. These ones we've put up here as the ones to suggest asking you guys for feedback on in particular. The ones below here, requesting findings from the SAFE pilot. We know the SAFE pilot is going on and they will be producing results, so those may not line up with the timing of this project. Establish incentives to have diverse research teams. I think that is sort of a kind of a bit of a given, in programs do that differently, but if we want to talk about that more, we can. Encouraging proposers to develop holistic long-term BI identities, implementing a hybrid model of funding, and incentivizing integration of community partners as co-PIs. So these last 2 were ones that I think program to some extent or not, the programs already do parts of these things. They were not ones that came from members of this commission, but we kept them up here. But I want to turn back to the prompts here and ask, in terms of this grouping of suggestions for program design, were there any ideas or questions you recall from past meetings that weren't reflected here? And I want to open the floor to that for a moment. Matt, yes.
Not sure if this is the right time to put it in. And we've discussed this a lot. It's a little speech here because it applies to some of these bullets and some other boxes as well. Yeah, I'm a numbers guy, as many of us are, but one thing that I have seen in just learned this from the discussion, it's very difficult to boil down what we're trying to do to formulas. To give specific, it's just really tough. In fact, I think it's probably not possible. And I could go on about that. But so, for example, the the box I3 there says, well, we want to say what portion of the budget should be for broader impact. I mean, it's just so much of a case-by-case basis. I think that it's a great idea. I'd love to try to quantify things, but I think it's just not really going to work out there. And some of the other, let's see, one of the bullets on the next line down here also said, let's see, that is the hybrid model. I mean, it sounds like the same thing. We're saying, okay, it's at 70% this and 30% that, and we're going to have different pools of money and so on. I admire the attempt to try to be quantitative and so on, but I think it won't work. So in a number of places here, the boxes present the idea, well, we're going to come up with a formula, a 50-50 mix, or this funding or that funding. I'm sort of been reluctantly gone over to the other side, that, trying to use numerical formulas, not just for these boxes, but for some of the other boxes down the line here. It's just not probably the way that's going to work out that we want to go. Sorry for the long speech.
Thank you, Matt. Any other comments related to that? And will I take that as a suggestion that this one might be worth setting aside because of feasibility concerns?
Yeah. I guess I guess so. Or rewritten. I'm not sure what to do with it.
So are we talking about this 1.31? Is that
Yes. Yeah.
highlighted? So let me, I'll just raise the possibility of we're already doing stuff in this way, and I'm not so sure highlighting it as an implementation, it might add to the noise of other implementation ideas that might come forward. But, I could imagine, I don't know who made this comment in the ERIS listening session, but I could imagine that they are looking for more instructions from NSF about what should go into budgets. And that kind of instruction just helps them negotiate with PIs about budgets. And most of the ERIS population are people who help with the creation of ideas, creation of programs, the execution of programs, and so on, the like broader impacts programs. So having more instruction from NSF can be desirable, but I think what we would rather do is say, please ask for what you need in your budget. Don't ask us to put some kind of limit on you when we don't have a limit to the program. Just ask for what you need. And that can be different for a lot of different types of projects and activities and so on. And you actually don't want us to tell you exactly how much that is. So I feel like our practice right now is much more inclusive, and it's much more set up for the variety of programs that can happen.
Do people generally say, I want a grant of $1 million, of which 200,000 would be spent on BI, or?
Depends on the program. So if the program says, the awards are limited to X amount total costs, then you work backwards from take out your indirect costs, and then you look to see what you have left over for direct costs, and then you figure out how you're going to allocate that generally across the board.
I see Scott has his hand up. And then Candace.
I just also had noted that this struck me as really problematic, because in some cases you could explicitly identify, yes, these funds are going into a BI topic, but in many other cases, it's just integral to the program. You're teamed with an institution that's performing work. You're working for economic benefit. Do you classify the whole project or the whole grant as BI in that case, or some subset? So very difficult to quantify. It's going to be different with every program, with every topic, with every subject. So I agree, it's quite problematic.
So I'm going to preemptively move that down because there have been a number of considerations raised. Candace, you had your hand up, so I wanted to make sure you had a chance to go, and then Julia.
I just put in the chat. That was essentially what I was going to say, what Scott just said.
Okay, and then Julia.
Yeah, I mean, this bullet is probably not right, but the whole issue of broader impacts is huge. And just because it's hard and we can't come up with a good answer at this point doesn't mean that we are entitled to shovel it all off to the side.
Yeah.
Wanda, perhaps you want to say something about the Big Ten listening session last week. I found that incredibly enlightening in multiple ways. And, while that's but one input, it certainly drove some things home for me that I hadn't heard in quite that way before.
Thank you, Julia. And in the interest of time, I will say we will be reporting out, I believe, at our 3-hour session, the February 20th meeting, to give all of our colleagues a full update of that excellent listening session. The attendees were drawn from 5 groups, just for background information: VPRs, provosts, sponsored research officers, public engagement officials, and another deans, graduate school deans. It was a very informed group of people that participated. They had firsthand policy and practice experience with broader impacts. So many of the suggestions that they made were enlightening, I think, to us from the NSB who participated. And they had many concrete examples of things that tended to work well for them, as well as things that did not work well for them. A recurring bottom line point that we hear from all of our stakeholders is the full assumption or belief that IM and BI are not weighted equally. No news to any of us on this call, but the specificity that they brought to light in terms of some ways that BI could be strengthened. I believe I heard, and I'm not positive, so don't quote me, the transcript will show us. We heard quite a bit about broadening participation, and particularly broadening participation being included within the intellectual merit criterion. Again, I am not absolutely positive, but we will get that for you for sure. The important point, the focus of this meeting was on institutional commitment. People raised the point and made presentations about the importance of the institutional reward structure, i.e. P&T, and how much teeth those P&T policies have with regard to societal benefits and broader impacts. And by and large, we're still hearing the same thing from various quarters, and that is it does not carry the same weight as IM does. But a number of institutions shared some very interesting and informative practices or policies that they're putting in place to lift BI in particular in terms of the value that the institution places on it and in terms of the quality and nature of the support that's provided to proposers. That's a bit longer than I had intended, but we will do a full report out, and I'd be remiss, have to thank Julia and Roger for an outstanding job in moderating, as well as our chair for giving keynote remarks. You'll hear more.
Thank you, Wanda. So I think in terms of this topical area of suggestions for program design, right? Sort of the bigger grouping are things that would be suggestions or considerations that would be built into programs as they're issued. They might, be more, general expectations or specific requirements in different cases. But I heard the one set of comments here that is, yes, these are things to consider. At the same time, the over specification or over formula, creating a formulaic process here might not work. The third piece I will bring in here is that sounds like there's a contingency or a dependence on further development of the policy notions. And so perhaps we can put a pin in these for now and sort of take this group and say, we recognize those, but none of we're not really hearing a common theme that rises out of that. Julia?
Yeah, this is a bit of a crosscut, but yeah, I started playing with the different blocks, and not just in program designs, but also the PI education and development. And a couple of things that really seem to cut across multiple boxes was, one is sort of standardization and common themes, and things that come up both in the program design and PI education and development, but also the extent to which things should be standardized versus the extent to which they should be, dependent on the particular program and the goals of that program. And so that is clearly an area, without getting specific for, exactly what we're talking about, that kind of, it is a grouping and maybe a structure for the report. So that was one. The other, which comes up a lot, particularly in the program designs, is incentivization for diverse teams, PIs, and proposing institutions. And so that is a common theme, and actually maybe suggests some grouping.
Thank you. Okay, I'll grab both of those comments here. And with that, I'm going to sort of move on from the, oh, Wanda, I saw your hand up.
Just very briefly, John, I would, when the consider blind review, we talked about that last week, noting that NASA is piloting and implementing this approach. And we heard from well-regarded social science researchers that we want to take a look at the research and the evidence about how effective this policy is. And we will be doing that. But I do want to note this in the context of this conversation.
Sure, thank you. Yes, I'll also add, and I see Alicia raised her hand, but I know the TIP office has recently announced, and there's been some press on that they're working with the Institute for Progress. It's one of the meta science groups to do just sort of that sort of background research and some, I believe, experiments along the lines of looking at the data that we have and seeing how different models would result potentially in different outcomes and things like that. And I know they've mentioned several of these topics as well, though I don't know they've progressed to a point of having the specific things that they're going to do yet. Alicia, yes.
So I just want to follow up on Wanda's comment. I'm pretty sure that NASA is not doing that pilot all across NASA. It's a teeny tiny little pilot. And to my knowledge, they don't have any evidence so far. So I wouldn't, if we wanted, it may not be available to us later on or within this report. We could certainly go and find that out, but I don't want us to hang our hat on pilots based on one small piece of something that NASA hasn't even finished.
That's an excellent point and a fair point, Alicia. And essentially, we're saying the same thing, and that is that the quality researchers are cautioning and advising that we be careful. But since it was up here as 1-1 consider blind review, we want to add these cautionary statements relative to that. But I agree with you fully.
John, you're on mute.
Apparently I bumped my mute button. Sorry. Thank you. Matt, you had your hand up.
Small thing, since you're on 1.1, friendly amendment I'm very interested, as you know, in blind review, if it's feasible and so on, and that's a very interesting thing to consider. I'm recommending, although it's intellectually fascinating to consider, I think as a practical matter, probably ought to just strike out lottery system. I just think that people will not go for that, even though it's a fascinating idea. Blind review, yeah, there's a lot to be said about that, but lottery system is just gonna hit some people, I'm afraid, the wrong way.
Okay, thank you. Moving down, suggestions for PI education development. Oh, Candice, do you have one more thing to add?
Well, it's sort of another cross-cutting topic that is mentioned in the theme we just discussed, but also comes up in different places within all three of these high-level categories, and that is the additional review criteria. And I'll just also point out that Julia brought up the idea of standardization, so it also it touches on that as a cross-cutting theme. And yeah, so if there are those several different topics that mention clarity around the use and language of additional criteria, might be an area that we could lump together or consolidate somehow.
So the additional review criteria are one of the color-coded crosscuts there. So there is a lumping of those already, but for further sort of consolidation of that, I think I'd be happy to take additional notes on that too. Suggestions for PI education development. There were 4 in this category. 2 of them we've identified as sort of a kind of a mini cluster here, and 2 we're suggesting I'd suggest might be sort of set aside for the moment. And let me explain that pre-screening here. So the 2 that are grouped together are both focus on providing additional guidance in education through outreach to PIs. Particularly, one was particularly focused on crafting stronger BI plans. The other was sort of more general, but targeted to like institutional level needs. Right. I think that there's an emergent thing about putting more out there for the community in general and pushing it toward them to so they get sort of build that knowledge base, build that capacity. The other 2, I-11 and I-12, I-11 is clarify the expectation novelty may be misplaced. That I believe when it came up as an implementation piece, what I'll say is I think that's basically already covered by what we discussed last week or on the 18th with respect to refreshing the merit review elements, and thus doesn't necessarily need to be a standalone thing here. And then, increasing the number of proposals submitted by underrepresented groups and individuals. That's currently the agency's agency priority goal. So that's something that is actively being pursued right now and counted. So I will leave that there and ask, do these groupings make sense? Was there anything we missed in this topic area? And are those set-asides potentially appropriate? Julia.
Yeah, just a small point. The one about increasing the number of proposals submitted by underrepresented groups and individuals. And I would also think minority serving institutions. But that fits in the potentially fits in the incentivization bucket. With one kind of cut anyway. So it kind of fits with some of the things back up in the upper category.
Mhm.
But other than that, no comment.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other hands up there. Okay, so I will keep moving on. Suggestions for reviewer performance. We had 8 items under this, 2 subgroupings and 1 that we left standing alone. Well, first subgrouping was about sort of panel membership. And so we had, the ones from the ERIS session back in March about including BI experts on panels, incentivizing community partners to participate in panels, and then other discussions about checking the demographic representation of experts on panels, moderating the membership and conversations. So it sounds like, paying attention to something in the paying attention to panel management space, focusing on that panel recruitment space is one. And then the other subgrouping here, I think basically falls under this top level 1 of ensuring that equal evaluation of criteria by reviewers, and then how can NSF evaluate the impact of BI and proposal reviews in the near term, and then the comment about considering use of a numeric scoring system, but maintaining program director flexibility. And so there's that. Did not want to move that, sorry. And then lastly, the standalone one was about ensuring consistency in language to reviewers and panelists, clarifying that additional criteria are not necessarily parallel to IM and BI. We set that one down here because we know in our policy discussions, potentially addressing a policy around additional merit review criteria was something that had been discussed. And so this one may, in fact, kind of fall subsequent to that, rather than a standalone here. But anything missed here, anything that might be set aside, do these groupings make sense? Okay. Marching onward. Suggestions for award decision-making, smaller number of items in this grouping, one sort of pairwise cluster that's really kind of more of a question altogether, and then 2 standalone ones. And so the 2 questions here were, how do additional criteria factor into portfolio balance? And does NSF track how funding decisions are affected by proposed IM and BI? As you can see, those are sort of questions. I don't know if they lead to a specific suggestion at this point, but there might be a question for you guys about either further refinement or other things we need to consider in this case. And then the 2 standalones were the encourage at least 5% of funding allocated to high risk, high reward research, and then piloting the use of science computation models in proposal review to augment human judgment in the merit review process. Pausing to open. Yes, Scott.
Kind of a clarification and question on 23. Do we know what percentage we're spending now on high risk, high reward? Is there any basis for comparison? I mean, I like the idea to encourage it. I just don't know if 5% is a increase or reduction, or. And we don't have to answer that, but that's what we should consider if we're going to say a particular percentage.
Didn't we hear that would be a big increase?
Big can mean a lot.
Well, I mean, from
double, yeah,
from like 1% or less.
So I will jump in with a point of information here. So what we heard previously is that NSF doesn't have a specific high risk, high reward category. And so there are a number of proxies that come into play with this, but none of them alone are exclusively high risk, high reward, and none of them are sufficient to describe the entirety of high risk, high reward. We have a number of mechanisms that program officers are enabled to use that are not dependent on external merit review. These are sometimes popularly conflated with being exclusively for high risk, high reward, but they're not necessarily the same. And so that has always been, I think, one of the challenges with this. Now, there was some time in the past, I think a number floated publicly that 5% might be a limit on those, but I have not been able directly to trace the origin of that to say if there was anything where anything was ever set as a specific target or goal. I see Anne has her hand raised. Yeah.
Yeah, in large part to second what you just said, John, I raised my hand before you got to that. Yes, my understanding is that the key is the 5% that we had been talking about, the number of awards that can be made by the program officer without seeking external review. And in part, these were designed for the program officer to make some high risk, high reward without the potential for conservatism that the full panel can sometimes display smaller awards, but that the program officers were not using anywhere close to whatever individual
That's right.
directorates or as that kind, Rapids, Eagers as a whole permitted. And you're right, I'm not sure whether we know it's a 5% or something else. So it's one way to attack the high risk, high reward, but it's by no means the only way. These are generally smaller.
As I said, I like the goal to increase it. Sounds like we just need to be consistent in our definition and tracking of it.
Mm-hmm.
Steve Leith and Wanda have their hands up, John.
Thank you. Steve, go right ahead.
Listen to what Ann said and then what John sent us. What John sent us is kind of what I remember the process being. I've often wondered if it, as much as people are driven by their own performance, since we've got a program in place for Transform Awards, what if we just held program managers more accountable? So if the goal is, I'll make this up, 5%, if a director didn't reach 2.5% or 3%, it would count against them, so that people would actually be motivated to look for these transformative projects and move them to the top in small numbers. Because I think right now, the risk reward is more like, well, gosh, if this fails, that's going to look bad on me. And I wonder if maybe we change the evaluation criteria on our program managers to give them some reward for sticking their neck out.
I'm going to label that back to the incentives crosscut. And I see Wanda is next, and then Kayvon, and then Julia.
Very briefly, we may, and I know it's already listed in diligent, but it seems like it might be very useful to take a look at the previous NSF publication on potentially transformative research or something like that. It's several years old, but still a foundational piece of work on our thinking about that. Two last points. It occurs to me that we want to give careful attention to the value of this topic of high risk, high reward, especially as it relates or as it informs the CHIPS and Science Act, which was a major driver to this commission, to this commission's work. And so I think if we consciously and intentionally factor that into our thinking, it may inform our suggestions around this topic, suggestions and possibly policy recommendations. And I remind us, especially because EAGER is a relatively small portion of the budget, as others have mentioned. One of the important points that Mac continues to mention to us that I don't think we have explored fully with regard to high risk search is that the extent to which we do address it, which we all agree is insufficient, is still talking about relatively small investments in contrast to major NSF investments in high risk, high reward, as some other agencies do. So I think that's worth keeping on our radar as well. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Wanda. And I will add, right, like if we're asking about the high risk, high reward portfolio versus specific mechanisms, right? Things like the LIGO, right, was certainly a high risk investment. It would not have fit under any of these special small mechanisms that we're talking about. And so the idea that we have to separate it from the external review process is one that we want to handle carefully. Yeah. But Kayvon.
Yeah, thank you. There were a couple of related points, and I'm not sure if they're elsewhere on the sticky board or what, but I feel like they tie into the same thing that we're talking about right now. One was, let's see, I wrote them down. The idea of de-emphasizing the expectation of novelty necessarily in the context of transformative or high risk, high reward, and at the same time, better recognizing the value of replication studies. And then finally, again, related to all this is potentially looking at more use of accomplishment-based renewals. So again, those were all specific items that in my mind had kind of clustered around this one.
So the first two that you mentioned about de-emphasizing, and those we clustered on the 18th in that review, in that action about following up on review of the merit review elements, because that's where those came from. So those one, right, they might ultimately logically connect to from one to the other, and so that interrelationship is something definitely to keep in mind.
And then Julia has her hand.
Maybe
Yes,
maybe
thank
the ABRs goes here since it's award decision making.
Yes. Okay, and then Julia, yes.
Yeah, well, just following up on one of the points Kayvon made, the business about novelty does show up in one of the bubbles further up in this particular column. Yes. It's just off screen at the moment. But the main point that I was going to make is that getting down here, and maybe particularly the way some of these are written, we are kind of treading and flopping back and forth between award decisions and accountability. And so just to be aware of that, I don't want to pick nits at the moment, but how the decisions are made or the implementation of policies with regard to making decisions is one thing. The other is accountability for making those decisions, and that kind of presumably goes over in the next column.
Thank you, Julia. You're giving me my segue. This is great.
Happy to oblige.
I wanted to check and see were there any other questions, comments on any of the other ones in this category before we moved over to the next column, which is accountability? Okay, seeing none, I will move on. Great. So accountability, we had, again, a lot of comments here. High-level subgroupings, suggestions that dealt with things that awardees would be, requests for awardees to report more information to us. Suggestions for things that NSF might report to the public. Suggestions, I think this, Julia, some of your connecting points are going to show up here, sort of internal process control, monitoring, accountability, ideas, and then sort of a little bit of a grab bag at the end, things that sort of, they kind of represent, they cross-cut, they touch multiple audiences, but involve sort of general public understanding of merit review. So I'm going to start at the top here. Suggestions for awardee reporting to NSF. There were two that we sort of pulled out at the top here. How can PIs and institutions be held accountable for assessments of measuring success within merit review element 3? Of course, we talked about potentially changing the merit review elements. So, there's a little bit of a, contingency in there, but then require PIs submit progress toward broader impacts goals in the annual report in a more robust and thorough manner than currently required. The rest of these, reward PIs who make progress in BI and penalize those who don't, ensure that all resources related to research activity meet accessibility guidelines, update and expand data collection from proposers and awardees, collect and track progress against DEIA goals, require community partners and stakeholder participation in reporting on the impact of investigations. All of this second row seems to be things that sort of fit under these two high-level questions. There's sort of detailed points in there more than specific suggestions. And so our thought coming out of this was that focusing on these two and recognizing these ones as notes for further work would be sort of a way to group those together. And so I want to pause. Talking so much, I'm getting a dry throat. Julia, go right ahead.
Yeah, okay. I'm wondering if there, something that's come up, I think, at various times in this conversation, certainly in others, it is the question of sort of longitudinal data, because the end of the grant is not really the best time to measure impact anyway. I mean, yes, you can do something, but what you really want is the impact over time. And, like they do with the doctoral survey, if there is something that, should we be saying something about that? Just asking the question.
So there were some separate comments on longitudinal data down here. I'll say the reason we grouped those outside of this is because reporting requirements on awardees are a distinct flavor of collection that longitudinal data may be better accumulated or collected, not necessarily from a reporting burden that extends beyond the period of an award on the PI, but through other mechanisms. And I know that is a topic of sort of active exploration, right? There's right, that's the whole science of science, field, right? Does that work? And so the methods for doing that are something that we want to keep in mind. Yeah. Say, anyone else on this first grouping? Okay. If not, and just raise your hand if I missed, I'll move on to the next one. Suggestions for NSF reporting to the public. Again, a large grouping of comments in this area. We found two sort of subtopical clusters in here and a couple of standalone ones that we sort of moved down here. First topic is basically include more information around the portfolio, particularly in the Merit Review Digest or other reporting mechanisms. The second topic is around performance metrics, goal setting, and having more quantitative targets for a number of different aspects of things and reporting on those. And then the standalone ones, COV panel should evaluate the quality of reviewers' comments about BI. That is part of the current, looking at reviewer comments is part of the current COV reporting format. So they are asked to do that, including longitudinal institutional funding rates in the Merit Review Digest. That data is available online currently, so that's something I can point you to. Developing mechanisms for prospective assessments of portfolios and developing tools that can establish the role of collaboration and innovation were a lot more exploratory and not necessarily ones that could, be the feasibility long-term of those is uncertain. So while they're things that I think and lots of folks at NSF are already sort of looking at and experimenting with, they're trying to experiment with, whether anything of that can be effectively institutionalized would be a question that isn't answerable right now. So I will pause here and ask the prompts. Are there anything that we've missed in this category area? Do the groupings make sense? Are there parts of these that we might set aside? Julia, yes.
Yeah, overall, this looks pretty good. The thinking again about an overarching theme, there is kind of running through a bunch of these, the question of what should be in the Merit Review Digest and maybe rethinking that.
Yeah, I will add a theme note here. Okay, thank you. Other hands, comments? So I'll just move that in between because those might be relevant. Yeah, okay. Great. Then I will move further down the list then. Oh, I saw there was one thing in the chat. Yep. Okay. And then suggestions for process control and monitoring. Two subgroups that we identified and put at the top here, and then a number of smaller ones that were, well, not necessarily smaller, but sort of more detailed ones that we put down here for the moment. Suggestions A20 and A21. Some adding institutional accountability measures and holding PIs accountable for DEIA commitments, and clearly communicate consequences when they do not. So I think that gets to some things that Julia, you mentioned sort of above here and previously, and how there's sort of where that sort of feedback loop ultimately is. And then a cluster around continuing pilots, science of science work, developing models, where there are things sort of, potentials that are out there, but really, the sort of known unknowns at this point. And then down at the bottom, a question about across the agency, what is percentage and variance of awards made to proposals that were not highly evaluated by reviewers? One about except that developing reliable metrics and monitoring outcomes and outputs is very hard, not try to create a foolproof system. Moving potential bias, I think that towards individual teams and organizations, I think that that's sort of a generally understood cross-cut, though not necessarily something that leads itself to a specific suggestion here. So I think that is a sort of a theme that will reoccur throughout these ideas. Similarly, longitudinal data is something that I think reoccurs throughout many of these topics. And again, that, and as Julia already pointed out earlier about the potential crosscut, right? The standards idea is something that pops up repeatedly, but it's not necessarily a standalone suggestion here. In terms of these groupings and thinking of these ones at the top, anything we've missed, anything we want to modify or further elevate or set aside? I will close that one then and move on. Thank you. Last grouping. We've actually made great time through this. Thank you all. Suggestions for general public understanding of merit review. 2 comments around clarifying portfolio balance responsibilities and sort of understanding how portfolio balance works more. A set of comments around broadening participation and DEIA and elevating that topic and connecting it sort of across strategies and implementation. And then a grouping here about educating the community about BI more, highlighting BI more. I think those are in part already happening, but also will flow a little bit more naturally from some of the policy things that we mentioned on the 18th with respect to further clarifying the elements and the criteria, and that in many cases those would be synergistic, and so we wouldn't be trying to educate beyond what's there. We would have updated policies that would maybe be more self-explanatory in some cases. And then 2 standalones right now. One, and I will try to zoom in a little bit more. NSF lead relevant conversations with chancellors, provost presidents about how to include BI in promotion and tenure. So I think maybe we need to set that we might have something coming on that in a future meeting, it sounds like. So it might not be one that we need to address right here. And then just the note that NSF does not have a formal revise and resubmit mechanism. I think that's something that is not necessarily, super well understood by the public, but it's not, doesn't necessarily lend itself here to a particular suggestion, and that came from one of our earlier sessions. Yep. Are there any other ideas or questions from the past meetings that aren't reflected here? Do these groupings work? Are there any of these that might be set aside? Steve, I see your hand is up. Yes.
Sure. What do we have? It seems to me that it would be very helpful at the end of a project to have an assessment by the PI of the success in hitting their IM and most importantly BI goals. Is that subsumed in one of the elements here to have a final report of successes and failures with regard to the goals initially stated in the proposal?
So I can jump in here and give a quick description. So the reporting that PIs do, there are annual project reports that are required annually throughout the life of the award. Those report in standardized format progress and activities and outcomes year to year across the award. The final one of those is a final annual report. It is not a re-summation of things that were previously reported. That is part of the sort of the government-wide RPPR, and I'm forgetting what that acronym actually stands for, but it was the government-wide grantee reporting standard, research grantee reporting standards that were developed by the interagency a little more than a decade ago at this point. NSF has an additional final reporting requirement called the Project Outcomes Report. And the Project Outcomes Report is a short for the public consumable description of the outcomes at the end of the project. What did they accomplish? Those reports are actually made public. They are paired with the abstract, right? The public description of what it was intended to do at the end of the award as part of the public record that is available and accessible and visible through the award search. So any awards that since about, I think 2014, someone can correct me on that, will carry the project outcome report with it on the public award sort of description webpage that is there for each one of our investments. They are explicit in that they have to address both intellectual merit and broader impacts. And so that data is there. Yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I'd like to dig into that with the help of staff.
Thanks. Other questions, comments? So I'm not seeing any other hands raised, but I'll pull out a last call. Or are there any points in either of these themes that we have covered that anyone wants to kind of return to or come back now that we've talked through it? Well, we have a few minutes left because we are on time at this point and have some parking lot time built in. So there was not anything explicitly moved to the parking lot. So I want to offer that now, but if not, we can start moving to wrap up. Okay. So seeing no further comments, I think I can stop the share here. And So I want to say first, thank you all for participating in this. But given that that was basically the agenda for today, I think we can now turn it back to Steve to actually wrap up. So with that, Steve, are you ready for the handoff?
Yes, I'm reluctant to lose this time, but I think we've all got a lot of food for thought. We'll be meeting in person on February 20th to continue our discussions. Additional information in preparation for that meeting will be forthcoming. Finally, I do want to acknowledge Candace Major, whose time on our commission has come to an end. Her insights on merit review processes have been invaluable. Candace not only oversaw review panels and programs as a program director, but she also trained program officers through NSF's Merit Review Bootcamp. These experiences made her the perfect person to help lead the commission's discussion of criteria evaluation along with Roger. Candace, we have truly benefited by your expertise. We wish you well in your future endeavors, and we hope you will stay in touch. Thank you again, and I look forward to meeting with you again next week. This concludes our business for today, and the open meeting is adjourned at 4:13 Eastern.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Brandon, are we clear?
It's taking a second. Hang on.
There. Okay. I see the
Okay, look.